Prepping my cars for winter last week didn't exactly go to plan. I should rephrase that. Prepping the S4 went just fine, but the TT fought me every single step of the way. We ran into issues, found problems I didn't know existed, and even my snow tires no longer fit due to my new suspension. We won't be able to fix every issue that came up last week in today's episode. However, if we can make just a little bit of progress and reduce some of the items on that list of to-dos, I will be more than happy. Let's handle things one step at a time. The first issue that I want to correct is being able to actually get my snow tires on the car. As a quick recap, the reason they would no longer fit is they are wider than my summer tires. This wheel and tire setup worked flawlessly last winter, however we are no longer on stock suspension. And with this new suspension geometry, the tires are hitting the coilovers at the ride height the car is set to. Now that's not exactly what you want your suspension and tires to be doing, so I decided to order some spacers to remedy this. I also picked up a wheel hanger, which I am excited to try. Towards the end of last episode, we measured the car for spacers. We had roughly half an inch of space to play with. Consequently, I decided to go with 10mm spacers. When it comes to spacers, you never want to go with exactly the amount of space you have. If it is exact, there's a really good chance you're going to end up rubbing. And since I'm prioritizing performance over looks, I don't really care if these are perfectly flush. Anything is going to be an improvement, especially when we can actually put the wheels we want to on the car. These snow tires cleared just fine on the rear. It was the front of the car where we had issues. Consequently, that's the wheel I'm going to be starting with today. Before we jump straight into putting on the wheels, since the car is in the air a little bit, now's a good time to take off the spoiler, which we sadly lost in the first day of snow. This is a pretty big bummer because I custom made this out of a universal lip, so I don't know if I'd ever be able to make one exactly the same. This lip has been with this car for a really long time, so in a way, it's kinda sad that it's no longer gonna be on it. When I made this, I didn't really know what I wanted from both the car and this channel, so I guess we can take this as a sign to move on to bigger and better things. Because right now, I've got bigger plans for this car and bigger plans for the channel. Safety-wise, spacers get kind of a bad rap, and I think a large portion of that is people not knowing that you need to get longer lug bolts whenever you run them. Lug bolts are designed to have a certain number of threads threaded into the wheel hub. If you run a spacer with OEM lugs, you're going to have less threads keeping it in place, which is a bit unsafe. So you should definitely upgrade the length of your lug bolts corresponding to the length increase of your spacers. Mine are size 2 and came with the spacers I bought. The extended lug bolts is generally just for spacers that are somewhat small though. If your spacer is large enough, it'll come with its own bolts to effectively just extend your hub. If that's the case, stock lugs can be run safely. Since this first wheel was a test, I double checked and we are no longer rubbing where we were last week, so we've already made some progress. We're good to put the rest of the wheels on. Before we get too far ahead of ourselves, you might be wondering how I knew what spacers to get for the car. Because, well, they're all going to be different. You effectively have two different surfaces you need to worry about mating successfully to the spacer. The first of which is the rotor itself, which is the easiest. Generally, so long as the spacer is designed for your bolt pattern, you should be good to go. The second of which is where it gets a little bit trickier. That's the wheel itself. You may have noticed that these spacers each have a lip on the outside. It's the place effectively that the wheel sits on. Well, there are different sizes of those lips depending on what wheels you're trying to mate the spacer to. I bought these spacers specifically for my winter wheel, so I made sure to pick spacers which were designed to mate properly to OEM style wheels, which these Fat 5s are. Sometimes the aftermarket wheels won't have nearly as much room as an OEM wheel to fit that size of a lip, so they may not fit properly. If the spacer does not fit flush without wobbling onto an aftermarket wheel, you know for a fact that you're not going to be able to get the right torque specs. Or if you do, you probably broke something along the way. That same sentiment applies to the hub as well. Just effectively make sure everything fits snugly without any sort of wobbling or tolerance. We'll definitely get a better look at the fitment towards the end of the video. For now, I want to move on to another issue that keeps recurring in the car. Another day of driving the TT with zero gear feel. Yay. If you missed this in the last episode, we have been having trouble with our Diesel Geek first gear getter. This is an interference fit bushing underneath the shift column that basically translates the lateral movement of the shifter. So without it, there's a whole range of movement that doesn't actually translate into selecting a gear. In other words, kind of important. This part's only about 8 months old, so I'm surprised that it's having issues so far. I reached out to Diesel Geek and they are sending me a new version, but that won't get here for a little bit. I still need to drive the car, so we gotta come up with a temporary fix because at this point it's been popping out every other day. A subscriber in the last video suggested we put the first gear getter on the other side of the bell housing in order to make it not pop off. This is not how Diesel Geek suggests you install it, but I think it's absolutely worth a try because at that point it physically can't fall off. As you'll see in a second though, it does come with its own cons. As a side note, I'm getting pretty good at removing this center console. I think my record's around 5 to 7 minutes right now. Hopefully I don't get too much more practice. According to the Diesel Geek suggested install, this first gear getter is supposed to come in through this side, and effectively it has an interference fit keeping it in that spot. The suggestion from the subscriber was to try putting it on literally just the other side. Super simple idea, and physically it no longer has the ability to fall off because it is always going to be around the shifter itself. First of all, this is a great idea. However, we do run into one issue that makes it maybe not the best long-term fix. The first gear getter is thick enough that on this side it comes into contact with the little bushing keeping the spring for the bell housing in place. This adds some friction when moving your shifter laterally trying to select a gear, so it takes a little bit more force to get into 5th and 6th. We'll see if it hitting the spring tensioner affects anything in the long run, but at least until they send me the new part, this will be hopefully good enough to get me by. We already have a new part from Diesel Geek on the way, so I'm more than interested in seeing if this fix is actually worth trying. My main concern is wearing down that rubber bushing that keeps the bell housing spring tensioned. If that breaks, there's going to be a whole other set of issues that we run into. So this may end up just being a temporary fix until the new part gets here. But it does get me the ability to drive the car again, which I am more than happy with. Let's knock out another quick fix item of the to-do list for the TT that occurred between the last episode and now. This car's got a hyper blinker because one of the 2 rear blinker bulbs is out. Thankfully, this is a really simple fix and it gives us the opportunity to learn about the rear taillights, which are fascinating from an engineering standpoint. I think serviceability was a key design thought when they were originally creating these rear taillights. Most taillights require you to use tools or some sort of a socket set to remove them from the car. The TT, however, uses these hand screws, meaning you can completely remove the taillight from the vehicle in about 30 seconds with no tools whatsoever. There are just 2 of the hand screws and the other side pops into place. To add to that design, every single bulb is accessible with literally a Phillips screwdriver. You don't need Torx, you don't need anything obscure, everything literally just comes out with 2 screws. That is a small engineering detail, but it's one I think is kinda rad. I always think it's awesome when something is designed to be serviceable by the end user as opposed to serviceable only by technicians at a dealership. Now, taillights may not be the best example in the world for engineering for the end user's usability, but I always think it's fun to see products that were engineered with the end user in mind. Coming in with no prior knowledge of how to do this, it takes maybe 3 minutes, including the time it takes to learn how this works, to replace a bulb on this car, which is something I can always appreciate. Whenever I replace a headlight or a taillight that requires you to remove the entire assembly, my process for reinstalling it is to, before bolting everything up, test the light to see if the changes actually affected anything. No use fully installing the light until you know it works properly. Now that we got the taillight fitted and the blinker fixed, I think it's time we check out the fitment improvement from those spacers. In my opinion, these spacers dramatically improve the fitment of these wheels on the car. Not only is the car now drivable as opposed to them literally not fitting at all, but they look so much better. I wouldn't go so far as to say they are perfectly flush for the setup. However, I would say they are perfect for what I want the setup to be: usable. They make the car look a lot more aggressive, and they make the wheels fill out the wheel well a lot more. I love how they made the car look, and to be honest, I also love the Fat 5s on the TT. These are the wheels I think of when I think of the Mark 1 TT. Don't get me wrong, I love this car's summer setup, but in my mind you can never go wrong with Fat 5s on a TT. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to watch my video. I truly do appreciate all the support we've been getting lately, and it blows my mind how many people are finding these series and liking the builds. So, thank you. If you enjoyed the video, consider liking and subscribing for more. It really helps my videos reach a new audience and my channel in general. I've got a lot planned for both of the projects. I've got almost every piece in place to completely transform the exterior of the TT, which is much needed. And I've got a pretty major upgrade for the S4 planned for the next week. Something the car's been needing for a long time. I hope you're as excited as I am. I'll see you in the next episode. Thank you again. Have a wonderful day.